The Cuban Missile Crisis is most often remembered as a dramatic standoff over Soviet missiles in Cuba, but this familiar framing obscures a deeper and more destabilizing reality that lay at the heart of the crisis. Because long before Soviet ships sailed toward the Caribbean, American nuclear missiles had already been positioned on the Soviet Union's doorstep, quietly deployed in Turkey and Italy as part of NATO's forward nuclear posture, creating a strategic imbalance that profoundly shaped Moscow's decisions and transformed a regional confrontation into the most dangerous nuclear crisis of the Cold War. In the late 1950s, as intercontinental ballistic missile technology was still maturing and strategic parity remained elusive, the United States relied heavily on forward-based nuclear forces to maintain deterrence, placing Jupiter medium-range ballistic missiles in allied countries that bordered the Soviet sphere, where their short flight times offered a powerful first-strike capability and reduced warning for Soviet leadership. These deployments were publicly justified as defensive measures designed to reassure allies and deter aggression, but from Moscow's perspective, they represented an existential threat, as missiles stationed in Turkey could reach key Soviet cities in minutes, compressing decision-making timelines and raising the specter of decapitation before retaliation could be ordered. The imbalance was particularly acute because the Soviet Union, at that stage, lagged behind the United States in reliable long-range missile forces, making the presence of Jupiter missiles not merely symbolic but strategically destabilizing, a reality that Soviet leaders followed closely through intelligence assessments and internal debate. Turkey's role was especially sensitive, as a NATO member bordering the Soviet Union's southern flank, hosting American missiles that transformed its territory into a forward nuclear launch platform, while Italy, though geographically further removed, reinforced the same principle of encirclement by placing American-controlled nuclear weapons deep inside Europe. These deployments were not widely discussed in public discourse, but they were central to Soviet perceptions of vulnerability, reinforcing a sense that the United States was willing to exploit its technological advantage to impose pressure at the very edge of Soviet territory. When Fidel Castro's revolutionary government in Cuba aligned itself with the Soviet Union after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, it presented Nikita Khrushchev with both a problem and an opportunity, as Cuba's proximity to the United States mirrored the strategic position of Turkey relative to the USSR, offering a potential means to redress imbalance and assert parity through symmetrical deployment. Khrushchev's decision to place nuclear missiles in Cuba was not driven solely by a desire to protect the island from American invasion, though that concern was real, but by a broader strategic calculation aimed at countering the Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy, signaling that if the United States could threaten the Soviet Union from close range, Moscow could do the same to Washington. This logic reflected a deeply Cold War mindset in which deterrence was measured not only in numbers, but in geography and visibility, and where the credibility of power depended on the ability to impose comparable risk on an adversary's homeland. Internally, Soviet leaders framed the Cuban deployment as a corrective measure, a way to level the playing field and force the United States to confront the consequences of its own forward deployments, while also demonstrating resolve to allies and rivals alike. The secrecy surrounding Operation Anadir, the code name for the missile deployment, reflected awareness of the risks involved, as Soviet planners understood that discovery would provoke a crisis, but believed that the strategic payoff justified the gamble. Meanwhile, American officials remained largely unaware of the depth of Soviet resentment toward the Jupiter missiles, viewing them as routine components of NATO defense rather than as catalysts for escalation, a misalignment of perception that would prove critical once reconnaissance revealed missile installations in Cuba. When U.S. intelligence confirmed the presence of Soviet nuclear missiles on the island in October 1962, the crisis that followed was shaped not only by the immediate threat to American cities, but by years of unacknowledged strategic pressure created by American deployments in Europe, pressure that Khrushchev now sought to convert into leverage. President John F. Kennedy and his advisors publicly framed the crisis as an unprovoked Soviet escalation, emphasizing the unprecedented nature of offensive missiles in the Western Hemisphere. Yet privately, they were acutely aware that the United States had placed similar weapons near Soviet borders, a fact that complicated moral arguments even as it strengthened the case for quiet compromise. The early deliberations of the Executive Committee of the National Security Council revealed this tension as officials debated military strikes, invasion, and blockade, while also considering the broader implications for NATO cohesion and the credibility of American commitments in Turkey, where removal of the Jupiters could be perceived as abandonment. The missiles in Turkey thus became both a strategic liability and a diplomatic obstacle, binding the United States to a posture that limited flexibility even as it raised the stakes of confrontation. As the naval quarantine around Cuba was announced and Soviet ships approached the blockade line, the crisis intensified under conditions of compressed time and mutual suspicion, with both sides acutely aware that miscalculation could trigger nuclear war, yet constrained by political narratives that left little room for public concession. Beneath the surface of public rhetoric, however, the question of the Jupiter missiles loomed large, shaping backchannel communications and influencing the contours of eventual compromise, as Soviet leaders insisted that any resolution must address the imbalance that had prompted their move in the first place. The Cuban Missile Crisis, when viewed through the lens of the Turkey and Italy missiles, thus emerges not as an isolated act of brinkmanship, but as the culmination of a longer cycle of escalation, driven by forward deployments, technological asymmetry, and the failure of each side to fully appreciate how its defensive measures were perceived as offensive threats by the other, setting the stage for a confrontation in which the survival of millions would hinge on secret negotiations, mutual restraint, and the willingness to quietly dismantle weapons whose existence had been largely invisible to the public eye. As the Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded in the tense days of October 1962, the strategic significance of the Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy became increasingly central to decision-making behind closed doors, even as public statements on both sides avoided explicit acknowledgement of their role, because admitting the symmetry between American deployments in Europe and Soviet deployments in Cuba would have complicated narratives of aggression and defense that leaders relied upon to maintain domestic and alliance cohesion. Within the Kennedy administration, the presence of the Jupiter missiles was a source of acute discomfort, as military advisors recognized that these weapons were already becoming obsolete, vulnerable to preemptive attack, and strategically inferior to submarine-launched ballistic missiles, yet politically sensitive because they symbolized American commitment to NATO allies who depended on visible U.S. protection. Turkey, in particular, occupied a precarious position, as its leaders viewed the Jupiters as tangible proof of American resolve against Soviet pressure, and any suggestion of withdrawal risked undermining confidence in the alliance and emboldening domestic critics who feared abandonment. Italy, though less exposed geographically, shared similar concerns, as the missiles stationed there were integrated into broader NATO planning and represented the forward edge of American nuclear deterrence in Europe. This alliance dimension constrained Kennedy's options, as any concession involving the missiles had to be managed in a way that preserved the appearance of strength and unity, even as the administration privately acknowledged that their removal could serve U.S. interests by reducing escalation risks. On the Soviet side, Khrushchev faced parallel pressures, as the deployment in Cuba had been presented internally as a bold assertion of parity and protection for a revolutionary ally, and withdrawal without tangible gains would expose him to criticism from hardliners who already questioned his leadership after earlier confrontations with the West. The crisis thus evolved into a complex bargaining process conducted through public posturing and private communication, where each side sought to secure essential interests while avoiding the appearance of capitulation. The most consequential exchanges occurred not in formal diplomatic channels, but through backchannel messages and personal correspondence, including Khrushchev's letters to Kennedy, which oscillated between conciliatory proposals and stern warnings, reflecting the internal divisions and emotional strain within the Soviet leadership. In one message, Khrushchev offered to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade the island, framing the crisis as a matter of security guarantees, while in another, he explicitly linked the Cuban missiles to the Jupiter deployments, proposing a reciprocal withdrawal that would restore strategic balance. Kennedy and his advisors recognized the logic of this proposal, yet they also understood that publicly accepting a trade involving Turkey would be politically explosive, risking backlash from allies and domestic critics who would portray it as bargaining away Allied security under duress. The solution that emerged reflected the delicate art of Cold War crisis management, combining public firmness with private flexibility, as the United States agreed secretly to remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey and Italy within a specified time frame, while publicly insisting that the resolution rested solely on the removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba. This secret understanding allowed both leaders to claim success, with Kennedy preserving the image of decisive action, and Khrushchev securing a tangible concession that addressed the strategic imbalance he had sought to correct. The secrecy surrounding the deal was not incidental, but essential, as revealing the trade would have exposed the reciprocal nature of the crisis and undermined the moral clarity each side sought to project, while also risking destabilization within NATO. For Turkey, the eventual removal of the Jupiters was presented as part of a routine modernization process, rather than as a concession extracted under pressure, a narrative designed to preserve alliance confidence and minimize domestic fallout. The missiles in Italy were handled similarly, quietly withdrawn as newer systems came online, their role in the crisis remaining largely obscured from public view for years. This hidden dimension of the Cuban Missile Crisis underscores how much of Cold War stability depended on secrecy, ambiguity, and the careful management of perceptions, as leaders balanced the need to reduce existential risk against the imperative to appear resolute. The episode also revealed the extent to which forward-based nuclear weapons, intended to strengthen deterrence, could instead create pressure for symmetrical deployments and escalation, drawing adversaries into dangerous cycles of action and reaction. By agreeing to dismantle the Jupiter missiles, the United States implicitly acknowledged that these weapons had become liabilities rather than assets, a recognition that would influence subsequent arms control efforts and contribute to a gradual shift away from the most destabilizing forms of nuclear deployment. Yet at the time, this acknowledgement could not be made openly, bound as it was by alliance politics and domestic narratives that equated compromise with weakness. The resolution of the crisis thus rested on a fragile foundation of mutual restraint and unspoken concession, illustrating how close the Cold War came to catastrophe and how narrowly it was averted through decisions made under extraordinary pressure. When Soviet ships turned back and missile sites in Cuba were dismantled under international inspection, the world exhaled in relief, largely unaware that the missiles threatening Soviet cities from Turkey and Italy had been just as central to the drama as those aimed at American cities from the Caribbean. The Cuban Missile Crisis, seen through this lens, emerges not as a one-sided confrontation resolved by forceful resolve alone, but as a complex negotiation shaped by prior deployments, alliance commitments, and the shared recognition that survival in the nuclear age required compromise, even when that compromise had to remain hidden from history's first draft. In the immediate aftermath of the crisis, the secret agreement to remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey and Italy began to reshape nuclear strategy in ways that were subtle but profound. As both superpowers absorbed the lesson that forward-deployed weapons with short warning times carried risks that far outweighed their symbolic value, even as public narratives continued to emphasize victory and resolve rather than mutual concession. Within the United States, the quiet dismantling of the Jupiters was justified internally as a modernization step, replacing vulnerable land-based missiles with more survivable submarine-launched systems. Yet the timing and secrecy underscored how deeply the Cuban Missile Crisis had shaken confidence in existing deterrent structures. The missiles were removed without fanfare, their withdrawal coordinated carefully with allied governments to prevent political backlash, while officials avoided any acknowledgement that they had played a role in the resolution of the crisis, preserving the public image of American firmness. In Turkey, the episode left a lingering sense of unease, as leaders who had accepted the missiles as a shield against Soviet pressure now understood that their territory had been used as a bargaining chip in a confrontation that nearly triggered nuclear war, a realization that complicated alliance trust, even as formal commitments remained intact. Italy's experience was less dramatic, but similarly revealing, as the quiet removal of the Jupiters highlighted how nuclear deployments in Europe could be adjusted without public debate, reinforcing the distance between strategic decision-making and democratic oversight. For the Soviet Union, the outcome validated Khrushchev's core objective of addressing the imbalance created by NATO's forward missiles, even though the concession had to remain secret and could not be presented as a clear triumph, leaving him vulnerable to criticism from those who viewed the Cuban adventure as reckless and humiliating. This internal backlash would contribute to Khrushchev's eventual removal from power, as rivals cited the crisis as evidence of erratic leadership that had brought the world to the brink of disaster, demonstrating how the hidden success of the Jupiter trade carried visible political costs. Strategically, the crisis accelerated a re-evaluation of nuclear posture on both sides, as planners recognized that stability depended less on proximity and speed than on survivability and communication, insights that would inform later doctrines and arms control initiatives. The establishment of the direct communications link between Washington and Moscow, often referred to as the hotline, symbolized this shift, acknowledging that misperception and delay posed existential dangers in a world of nuclear weapons. The Cuban Missile Crisis also reshaped alliance dynamics, as NATO members became more aware of the risks inherent in hosting nuclear weapons and more cautious about deployments that could entangle them in superpower confrontations beyond their control. This awareness did not immediately dismantle forward-based nuclear strategies, but it did introduce greater sensitivity to escalation risks and a growing willingness to consider arms control as a means of managing rivalry. Viewed through the lens of the Turkey and Italy missiles, the crisis emerges as a turning point in Cold War thinking, revealing that deterrence based on symmetrical vulnerability was more stable than one-sided advantage, and that attempts to exploit technological superiority could provoke countermeasures that brought the world closer to annihilation. The secret nature of the Jupiter trade delayed this recognition in public discourse, allowing simplified narratives of victory to dominate for years. But within strategic circles, the lesson was clear, shaping subsequent negotiations over test bans, non-proliferation, and the eventual reduction of the most destabilizing weapons. The crisis thus stands not only as a moment of peril narrowly avoided, but as a catalyst for a more cautious, negotiated approach to nuclear rivalry, one born not of trust, but of shared fear and hard-earned experience. The missiles in Turkey and Italy, once central to NATO's deterrence posture, faded quietly into history, their significance overshadowed by the drama of Cuba. Yet their role in precipitating and resolving the crisis underscores how deeply the Cold War was shaped by deployments that were rarely visible to the public, but decisive in the calculations of leaders. The legacy of this episode lies in the recognition that nuclear stability could not be achieved through unilateral advantage or forward pressure alone, but required an understanding of how one side's defensive measures could appear as offensive threats to the other, a lesson that would echo through subsequent decades of arms control and crisis management. As historians and policymakers later revisited the Cuban Missile Crisis, with greater access to declassified records, the role of the Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy emerged as one of the clearest examples of how hidden assumptions and unspoken grievances could drive superpowers toward catastrophe, revealing that the crisis was less a sudden Soviet provocation than the culmination of a longer, reciprocal escalation that neither side had fully acknowledged at the time. This reassessment challenged triumphalist narratives that portrayed the outcome as a simple victory of resolve, instead highlighting the degree to which compromise, secrecy, and mutual vulnerability shaped the final resolution. For the United States, the realization that its own deployments had contributed directly to Soviet risk-taking prompted a more nuanced understanding of deterrence, one that recognized the dangers of forward-based systems that compressed decision-making and incentivized preemption. This understanding did not eliminate nuclear brinkmanship, but it did temper it, encouraging strategies that emphasized survivability over proximity and stability over symbolic assertion. For the Soviet Union, the crisis confirmed both the necessity and the peril of seeking parity through dramatic gestures, demonstrating that while bold moves could force negotiation, they also carried immense political and strategic risk, especially when conducted under conditions of secrecy and technological asymmetry. The removal of the Jupiter missiles addressed an immediate imbalance, but the manner in which it was achieved left lingering bitterness within the Soviet leadership. As Khrushchev was denied public acknowledgement of a concession he regarded as central to the crisis's resolution. This dynamic contributed to internal instability in Moscow, reinforcing a pattern in which leaders bore personal responsibility for systemic risks and were judged harshly for miscalculations, even when outcomes avoided disaster. Within NATO, the episode quietly altered attitudes toward nuclear hosting, as governments became more aware that their territory could become the focal point of superpower confrontation without their full control, a realization that would resurface during later debates over missile deployments in Europe. The Turkish experience was particularly instructive, as it exposed the vulnerability of frontline states whose security was bound to decisions made in distant capitals, fostering a more cautious approach to alliance politics even as formal commitments endured. The crisis also underscored the limits of secrecy as a long-term strategy, as the delayed revelation of the Jupiter trade complicated historical memory and public understanding, obscuring the reciprocal nature of the confrontation and reinforcing simplified narratives that underestimated the role of compromise in preserving peace. Over time, this distortion influenced how subsequent crises were interpreted, sometimes encouraging overconfidence in the effectiveness of coercive diplomacy while downplaying the importance of addressing underlying grievances. Yet among those tasked with managing nuclear arsenals, the lesson was unmistakable that stability required not only credible deterrence, but also restraint, empathy for adversary perceptions, and mechanisms for communication that could diffuse tension before it spiraled out of control. The Cuban Missile Crisis, when fully understood, thus stands as a case study in the dangers of mirror imaging and misperception, illustrating how actions taken for reassurance can be interpreted as threats and provoke symmetrical responses that escalate risk. The Turkey and Italy missiles exemplify this dynamic, as weapons intended to strengthen NATO deterrence instead became catalysts for a confrontation that nearly destroyed both sides. The legacy of this episode informed later arms control efforts, including agreements to limit missile deployments and reduce forward-based systems, reflecting a gradual acknowledgement that some forms of deterrence were inherently destabilizing. Even so, the persistence of nuclear weapons ensured that the fundamental dilemmas exposed in 1962 would never be fully resolved, only managed through vigilance and negotiation. In the end, the Cuban Missile Crisis remains one of the Cold War's most sobering lessons, not because it demonstrated the effectiveness of brinkmanship, but because it revealed how close the world came to annihilation through a series of rational decisions made within flawed frameworks, and how survival depended on leaders' willingness to compromise quietly, dismantle dangerous deployments, and recognize that in the nuclear age, security could not be achieved at the expense of an adversary's sense of vulnerability without inviting disaster. The final significance of the Cuban Missile Crisis, viewed through the hidden lens of the Turkey and Italy missiles, lies in how it permanently altered the psychological foundations of the Cold War, forcing both superpowers to confront the reality that nuclear confrontation was not governed by clear moral lines or unilateral strength, but by fragile perceptions, reciprocal fear, and the cumulative effects of decisions taken years earlier under different assumptions. The crisis revealed that strategic deployments do not exist in isolation, and that weapons placed for reassurance can generate insecurity on the other side, producing reactions that appear irrational only when their origins are ignored. For the United States, the quiet removal of the Jupiter missiles marked an implicit acknowledgement that forward-based nuclear weapons with minimal warning times were liabilities rather than assets, even as public narratives continued to emphasize firmness and victory, allowing political leaders to preserve credibility while adapting strategy behind the scenes. For the Soviet Union, the outcome confirmed that parity could be achieved through negotiation as well as confrontation, but also demonstrated the personal and political risks borne by leaders who push the system to its limits, a lesson that shaped subsequent Soviet caution and contributed to a more conservative approach to nuclear crisis management. The secrecy surrounding the missile trade delayed public reckoning with these truths, but within military and diplomatic circles, the implications were profound, accelerating the search for arms control mechanisms that could reduce the likelihood of accidental or preemptive war. The crisis strengthened the case for agreements that addressed not only numbers, but deployment patterns, recognizing that geography and warning time were as destabilizing as sheer explosive power. This shift would later find expression in treaties that limited certain categories of weapons and sought to manage escalation through transparency and verification, reflecting a hard-earned understanding born of near catastrophe. The Turkey and Italy missiles, once symbols of NATO resolve, thus became silent catalysts for a transformation in strategic thinking, their disappearance from public consciousness mirroring the way their role in the crisis was deliberately obscured to preserve political stability. Yet their legacy endures in the lessons drawn by those responsible for managing nuclear arsenals. Lessons that emphasize empathy for adversary perceptions, the dangers of symmetrical escalation, and the necessity of communication under pressure. The Cuban Missile Crisis ultimately stands not as a triumph of brinkmanship, but as a warning about its limits, illustrating how easily rational strategies can converge toward disaster when shaped by fear and misperception. By exposing the reciprocal nature of escalation, the crisis undermined simplistic narratives of aggression and defense, revealing a Cold War world in which survival depended on recognizing shared vulnerability rather than asserting dominance. The hidden trade over the Jupiter missiles encapsulates this reality, showing that the most consequential decisions are often those concealed from public view, negotiated quietly to avert outcomes too catastrophic to contemplate. In remembering the crisis through this angle, the Cold War appears less as a series of dramatic confrontations resolved by strength, and more as a prolonged struggle to manage the consequences of power in an age where mistakes could end civilization. The enduring lesson is sobering, that nuclear stability is not achieved through superiority alone, but through restraint, mutual understanding, and the willingness to dismantle even prized assets when their existence threatens the very security they were meant to protect. The final reckoning of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when understood through the Turkey-Italy missile dimension, is that the most dangerous moment of the Cold War was not resolved by one side forcing the other to back down, but by both sides quietly dismantling a cycle of escalation that neither had fully acknowledged creating, exposing a nuclear world governed less by clear victories than by shared vulnerability and imperfect understanding. The Jupiter missiles, deployed years earlier as instruments of reassurance and deterrence, became catalysts for catastrophe precisely because they compressed time, magnified fear, and signaled intent in ways their architects underestimated, demonstrating how strategic logic can drift from political reality when weapons are placed close enough to eliminate reflection. The crisis forced leaders on both sides to confront the truth that nuclear strategy could not rely on proximity, secrecy, or pressure without courting annihilation, and that stability depended on recognizing how one's own defensive measures appeared through an adversary's lens. The secret agreement to remove the missiles from Turkey and Italy marked a turning point, not because it was publicly celebrated, but because it established a precedent for resolving existential threats through reciprocal restraint, rather than unilateral dominance. A precedent that would quietly shape future arms control efforts and crisis behavior. For President Kennedy, the lesson was that credibility could be preserved without maximal escalation, provided compromise was managed discreetly and framed within a narrative of resolve, while for Khrushchev the lesson was more bitter, as achieving strategic parity through negotiation came at the cost of personal authority within a system that punished visible risk-taking. For NATO allies, particularly those hosting nuclear weapons, the episode revealed the uncomfortable reality that their territory could become the front line of superpower rivalry, subject to decisions made far beyond their borders, a realization that would later resurface during debates over missile deployments in Europe. Historically, the delayed recognition of the Jupiter trade distorted public memory of the crisis, reinforcing myths of simple victory and obscuring the deeper truth that survival hinged on mutual concession, not coercion alone. Yet among strategists and historians, the crisis became a foundational case study in escalation dynamics, highlighting the dangers of mirror imaging, the instability of forward deployments, and the necessity of communication under extreme pressure. The Turkey and Italy missiles stand as reminders that the Cold War's greatest dangers often lay not in dramatic gestures, but in routine policies carried out without full appreciation of their cumulative effects. In the end, the Cuban Missile Crisis endures not as a testament to the effectiveness of brinkmanship, but as a warning etched into history showing that nuclear peace is fragile, contingent, and sustained only when leaders are willing to dismantle even their most powerful tools in the service of survival. The hidden bargain over the Jupiter missiles encapsulates this reality, revealing that the Cold War was ultimately a struggle, not just over ideology or territory, but over whether humanity could learn to step back from the brink it had constructed for itself.